Chapter 9. Classes were not in session at the University of Michigan on Sunday. Angela didn't expect them to be, but she drove the 2 hours to the college with the hope that she'd at least be able to find one person who could tell her how to get hold of Professor Alan Spark, the author of the article she had read on the meteor. Luck was with her. She spoke to only one janitor and 2 students in the science building, and was directed straight to the professor himself. It seemed Spark reserved private tutorial hours on the weekends for his students. He was unoccupied when she entered his office. A tall, thin man of about 40, he had a trimmed brown mustache and the nervous movements of a bona fide bookworm. Judging by the photographs hanging on his walls, which showed him in various exotic parts of the world, he led an interesting life. He welcomed her and asked her to have a seat. At first, he thought she was one of his students. She quickly explained that she was a senior at Point High, and that she was doing an article for the Point Herald on the safety of the water she and her classmates were drinking. She asked where she had heard of him, and she showed him the article from the Science Journal, which she had stolen from the library. He was immediately interested. "I can give you my point of view on the matter," he said, "but I'll have to ask that you keep my name out of your article." "Why's that?" she asked. He gave a wry smile. "Because I want to continue to teach at this fine institution of higher learning, and, according to my superiors and my wife, I've created enough controversy in regard to the water in Point Lake. Of course, you probably remember the illnesses reported among the students at your high school last fall. I assume that's why you're doing your article. I didn't live in Point then, but I've read about them. Over 30 students reported various symptoms: nausea, headaches, blurred vision. There were several episodes of fainting. Experts were called in to study the matter, physicians and chemists and the like. I wasn't invited, however, because I was not a favorite of the local school board." "Why didn't they like you?" Angela asked. "I had already spoken out against placing the school next to the lake, well before it was built. I was specifically worried about having the school's drinking water come from the lake. I didn't believe it was healthy to drink." "Why?" she asked. "This is where I ran into difficulty with the school board and their assembled experts. I am a geologist. I am not a physician or a biologist or a chemist. My specialty was not viewed as relevant to the matter of the drinking water, although I had done extensive studies on the lake and the local terrain. My specific views, when I finally aired them, were seen as irrelevant. In fact, I could go so far as to say I seriously damaged my reputation as a scientist in general by speaking against the location of the school." "What did you think was wrong with the water?" she asked. He was slow getting to the point, and she was already hungry, although she had eaten in the car before going to look for him. She had eaten pretty much non-stop since she had awakened that morning. It was the only thing that soothed the throbbing in her head. It was 10 times worse than it had been the day before. What the hell had Jim done to her last night, she wondered. Besides bite off a chunk of her tongue, her mouth continued to ache. "You have read my article on the meteor that formed Point Lake," Spark said. "In it, I talk about the high magnetic content of the iron ore that was thrown off when the meteor struck the Earth. The effect of that magnetism is strong at the location of the school. It is extremely strong on the bedrock of the lake." He paused. "Have you ever read about the health problems of people who live next to high-tension electrical wires?" "No," Angela said. "They often complain of headaches and fatigue. Not all people, you understand, just some. There are various theories as to why this is so. A popular one is that the electromagnetic balance of the body is upset by the magnetic field the wires give off." "Wires give off magnetic fields?" she asked. He was too much a scientist. He was losing her. "Yes," he said. "A magnetic field is generated in a circular direction around the electrical current of a wire. That's simple physics. Now, at Point Lake, we have a situation where a large body of water is resting on top of highly magnetic iron ore bedrock. When the plans for the school were being drawn up, I raised the point that I thought it might be unhealthy for the students to drink water that had been subjected to a magnetic field on a continuous basis." "Can water become magnetized?" she asked. "This is one place where I ran into trouble with the school board, and the scientific community as a whole. To answer your question, in the traditional sense, no, you cannot have magnetic water. You need a material such as iron to create a positive and magnetic polarity. By the way, do you know how many polarized atoms are required for an entire iron body to become magnetized?" "I can't say that I do," Angela replied. "Less than 1 in 100, Sparks said. "Really?" Angela nodded as if she was impressed. What he was saying was interesting, but she wasn't sure where he was going with it. Her stomach growled. Feed me or I will eat you, it seemed to be saying to her. It is a phase transition, Spark continued. One moment, an iron ore is non-magnetic, and then just a few more atoms are polarized and the whole body of matter becomes magnetic. It's a fascinating phenomenon. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. I spoke against the students drinking water that had been exposed to such a magnetic field. Even though water itself cannot be made magnetic, there are subtle changes that take place in water that has been exposed to such a field. Water is made up of 2 hydrogen atoms for every 1 of oxygen. That arrangement is not changed when water is placed close to a magnet, but the arrangement of the molecules themselves in the water probably does change. Probably? Angela asked. Does it or doesn't it? That change is debatable. I think it happens. I think the molecules all line up in certain ways, and that affects how the water reacts with other molecules. Other scientists say it doesn't, but in experiments it has been proven that plants that are watered with water that has sat in a magnetic container either die or don't do well. Then the water must change in some way, Angela said. That's what I say. The physicians your school board consulted with said it was talking pseudoscience, but there is one thing that is interesting about Point Lake on the surface that makes it different from any other lake in the area. What's that? There are no fish in it. There never have been. No fish, no worms, no aquatic plants, nothing. That's interesting, Angela said. You think that would have sounded an alarm. It didn't, but let me continue. The magnetism was only one of the things that bothered me about the water in Point Lake. There's also a high concentration of an unidentified fossilized microorganism in and around the lake. Are you serious? Angela asked. Yes. But I thought the water was thoroughly tested. I didn't read about an unidentified microorganism. And you won't read about it anywhere unless I write an article on the matter, Spark said matter-of-factly. I've studied this particular organism more closely than anybody. But didn't other people know about the organism? Angela asked. I can't believe they let us drink water that had something deadly in it. Many people know about the organism, although, except for me, nobody knows its specific qualities. Nobody considers it dangerous. Why not? She asked. Because, as I said, it is a fossilized organism. It's dead. You cannot be infected by a dead organism. Then why are you concerned about the organism? She asked. Spark hesitated. That question opens the door to a mystery or pseudoscience, depending on how you want to look at it. He paused. I don't know if this is the time or place to go into it. Angela leaned forward in her seat. Please do. I won't put it in my article if you don't want me to. If it is of no use to your article, why do you want to hear about it? Because I'm curious, Angela said honestly. Spark considered. What inspired you to write this article now, a year after the students' complaints? Angela stared him in the eye. Students are getting sick again. Spark raised an eyebrow. I didn't know about that. We who go there know. Interesting, Spark said. I read about that girl at Point High who shot her friends. Did that have anything to do with what we were discussing? I think it did, Angela said. Could you elaborate? First, I'd like to hear what led you to believe that a dead organism could be unhealthy. Then you will tell me what is happening at the school? I can tell you what I know, Angela said. Fair enough. Spark glanced at the door to make sure no one was listening in from the other room. The organism concerned me because it was not in any book. It has a DNA structure unlike anything on record. In fact, I can go so far as to say it doesn't have DNA in the usual sense. Wait a second. If it's so different, wouldn't half the biologists in the country be studying it? Spark spoke with anger. There are 4 full professors of biology here on this campus. I have been unable to persuade even one of them to look at this organism. That seems absurd. You don't know how badly my reputation was tarnished by my protesting the use of Point Lake as a source of drinking water. When I approached my colleagues about the organism and told them how unique I thought it was, they weren't interested. They thought I was unstable at the least. But to be fair, it is not as if a biologist can glance in a microscope and note the unusual qualities of the organism. It has to be studied for some time. My colleagues didn't want to put in the time. But let me go on. Point Lake is not the only home of this particular organism. But you said it wasn't in any book. It isn't, he said, but I have found it elsewhere. Where? She asked. In Chile, in South America, high in the Andes. Angela took a sharp breath. Where the other meteor crashed. The one that you mentioned in your article? That is correct. It is currently called Lake Kuro. but the language of the Ropans who used to live there, it was known as Lake Sentia. Sethia, Angela whispered. Spark sat up. What did you say? Nothing. I heard you. I see you have done your research. The Manton used to call Point Lake Sethia, or Bath of Blood. The similarity in the names is disturbing, and I have no way of explaining it. Worse, I have no reasonable way of explaining why the histories of the two lakes are the same. The Manton considered Point Lake an evil place. I have read the stories, Angela interrupted. I'm sure you have. You know about the Katu? Yes, I do. You might be surprised to learn that the Ropans spoke of a similar race of beings that came from Lake Sentia. They were called the Kalar. The names, Angela guessed. Again, similar, I know. It's peculiar because the Manton and the Ropans have entirely different languages. But as far as the two meteor lakes were concerned, they were speaking the same language. What were the Kalar supposed to be like? Angela asked. The legends depict them as being like the Katu in many respects. They were evil, they craved human flesh. They could transform people into creatures like themselves. Could they fly? I know nothing about that attribute, Spark said. The Kalar were transformed human beings? Angela asked. Spark hesitated. It is my understanding from studying the Kalar myths that the original ones were not supposed to be from this planet. Which planet were they from? Angela asked. Now we are way off the train of scientific conjecture. I don't care. Tell me what you know. Spark shrugged. The Ropans were excellent astronomers. They knew the planets orbited the sun before Western civilization did. They believed the Kalar came from the fifth planet. More humans would travel from the third planet to the fifth, and more of her kind would take birth. Where did that come from? Her dream? What an amazing coincidence. As amazing as the coincidence of the names. Which planet is that? Angela asked. The fifth planet from the sun right now is Jupiter, but the Kalar definitely could not have come from there. Jupiter is a gas giant. It has a poisonous atmosphere and a crushing gravitational field. Life as we know it could not evolve there, but... Spark hesitated. What? You have to understand that talk like this has little to do with scientific theory. It is more in the region of wild speculation. That doesn't bother me. This whole subject is wild. You have a point there, Spark said. It is likely that in the past, the fifth planet from the sun was not Jupiter, but another planet. Do they often switch places with each other? Spark chuckled. No, but between Mars and Jupiter is the asteroid belt. It is commonly accepted that the asteroids are what is left of the original fifth planet. What happened to it? No one knows, but for some reason or another, it blew up. When? Angela asked. Most astronomers would say it was millions, if not billions of years ago. They based that estimate on the time when many meteors hit the Earth. These ancient meteors, both large and small, are believed to have hit the Earth when the original fifth planet broke up. Do you believe that? Angela asked. I believe that when the fifth planet exploded, it threw good-sized rocks our way. Most must have landed in the oceans. We see evidence of a few on land, however. Wait a second, Angela interrupted. You said in your article that Point Lake was formed less than 100,000 years ago. You said that the lake in South America was formed at the same time. At about the same time, yes. Angela saw what he was driving at, even though he was reluctant to say it aloud. So you believe the fifth planet blew up then, not millions of years ago, but only 100,000 years ago. You think these two meteors came from that planet's breaking up. Spark nodded in admiration. You're perceptive. Yes, I think the main meteoric bombardment of our planet was from another source, at a time near the formation of our solar system. But I think Point Lake and Lake Kura were formed by meteors that came from a planet that had life on it. Angela almost jumped out of her chair. It was all coming together. Because of the microorganisms? She exclaimed. Spark sighed. Yes. Because it doesn't look as if they came from here. Spark sighed again. Yes. Why does that depress you? You have to understand the scientific view of life in the solar system. Besides Earth, Mars was the only planet thought to have a chance of having evolved life, but the findings of the Voyager probes made it appear unlikely that the place is anything but dead. My esteemed scientific colleagues would, therefore, be reluctant to sanction the theory that life had evolved on a world even farther from the sun than Mars, such as our original fifth planet. But it could have, Angela said. Yes, I think so. If the atmospheric conditions were ideal, the surface of the original fifth planet could have been every bit as warm as Earth is today. Then what's the problem? Why did they hound you out the door? Because of what I mentioned a moment ago. that the fossilized microorganism has an extraterrestrial origin. Spark stopped and cleared his throat. I made the mistake of suggesting the possibility in the wrong circle of people. But it seems a reasonable theory to me, especially since the microorganism has been only found in the vicinity of these 2 meteor hits. I appreciate your support, believe me, but you have to understand the context in which these theories of mine were brought up against me. I was warning against using Point Lake as a source of drinking water for high school students. I had already published my article connecting Point Lake to Lake Currow. I had already spoken about the similar microorganisms located at the 2 places, although I had not written about them. The supporters of the school location, particularly the contractor who was to build the school, used that information to portray me as a charlatan. Little green bugs from outer space. They made it into a circus. They even tried to demolish the theory that a meteor had originally formed the lake, which of course was ridiculous. Spark paused to smile. But that same contractor changed his mind when he tried to dig the foundation for the school. He could hardly cut into the ground, it was so hard. I heard he lost a lot of money on the job. I'd like to backtrack for a second, Angela said. You said the experts were not concerned about the microorganism because it was dead, but you were concerned. Why? I believe many organisms might have survived the impact of the meteor. Why? Because I have researched the history of both lakes. Of course, I don't believe in the horror stories that have grown up around them, but I feel there must be something unsavory about the water in the lakes. The Mantons and the Ropans both got sick from drinking it. There has even been recent history concerning the dangers of Point Lake, from the early settlers in this area. To this day in Chile, Lake Currow is completely shunned. It is seen as a source of illness. No one even lives near it. Also, there is the fact that there are no fish in either lake, but if you ask me, if it is the organism or the magnetism that causes all these problems, I'd have to say I don't know for sure. If you ask me if the organism is from the 5th planet, I don't know. They are all intriguing theories, but I do know this for a fact. The kids who drank the most water from Point Lake were the ones who got sick. What do you mean the most water? Angela asked. It was hot last fall. The football team and the cheerleading squad practiced in that heat. They drank substantially more of that water than anybody else, and they were the kids who got sick. That's right. Angela had never put that together before, and it had been staring her right in the face. So we have 2 possible sources of contamination here, the magnetism and the organism. That's correct, Spark said. Is it possible they work together? I don't understand your question. You said water that had been exposed to a strong magnet was bad for plants and fish. Is it possible that the organism thrives in such water? I never thought of that before, but I doubt it. Why? Because living things don't appear to like such water. Living things on this planet, Angela said. Spark was uncomfortable. I would be extremely reluctant to put the 2 ideas together. Why? If the organism came here from an exploded planet, then it came here on a piece of home. Maybe the whole surface of the 5th planet was magnetic. Spark was surprised at her wild postulating, although impressed. You talk as if you've been there. He glanced at his watch. I wish we could talk more, but a student of mine will be here in a few minutes. Before you go, I'd like you to briefly describe what is happening at Point High. Angela stood and thought for a minute. She had believed Mary was insane, even when she found the blood caked into the crack in the floor of the warehouse. Even when Jim had mingled his blood with hers, and given her an appetite for red meat that couldn't be satisfied. It hadn't escaped her notice that there was more iron in red meat than in practically any other food. What was her body doing? Trying to change her into one huge polarized alien microorganism? It sure felt that way. Angela now believed everything Mary had said was true. We've got a few monsters on the loose, Angela told Professor Spark. Their numbers grow daily. I might be turning into one myself. I sure hope not. But I've got cravings no teenage girl should have. I'm so hungry right now I could eat you alive. I know you'll think that's crazy, but remember how people thought you were crazy to connect the 2 lakes? Don't toss out those stories about the Katu and the Kalar too quickly. There's a lot of truth in them. Spark was stunned. Are you saying you're sick too? Angela threw back her head and laughed. I had a dream last night that I was an astronaut who came back to Earth after a visit to the 5th planet and ate my best friends. Then I changed into a huge bat-like monster and was eventually hunted down by men with laser guns. Sounds pretty corny, huh? Except, my new boyfriend's a member of Point High's football team. He's the quarterback. He drank a lot of that bad water. I think he might be quarterbacking the whole show. His name's Jim Klein, and he's the guy Mary Blank was trying to kill when the police stopped her. I helped them, for God's sake. I saved Jim's life. But you know what? She leaned closer. I wish now I had let her kill the bastard. Angela, Spark began. Thank you for your time, Professor, Angela said, turning away. I've got to go. I've got to eat. She ran from the room, and it was well for him that he didn't try to stop her. All of a sudden, he had begun to smell too good to resist. Chapter 10. Angela heard on the radio, of all places, that Mary Blank had been released on $500,000 bail. On a Sunday, for God's sake, Angela thought. Nguyen had been right about how good her lawyer was. Angela was sitting in a McDonald's eating 3 extremely rare Big Macs, and finding them far from satisfactory, when she got the news. A couple of 14-year-old boys sat across from her with a ghetto blaster. She grabbed it out of their hands when she heard Mary's name, but the newscaster made no mention of where Mary was going, except to say that she had to remain in the area. Hey, one of the boys protested, that's ours. She smiled. They were both rather plump, which she thought made them more attractive somehow. It might be fun to squeeze them. She handed them back their boombox and gave the one who had spoken a pat on the head. Eat your food and keep your mouth shut, little boy, she said sweetly. Angela got back in her car and drove to the expressway. She had an idea where Mary would be hiding out. Her family owned a cabin in a forested area outside of Kemp, which lay roughly between the University of Michigan and Point. Angela had been there twice. It wouldn't be too far out of her way to swing by the cabin and have a long talk with Mary about the Katu and the missing 5th planet and the long kiss Jim had given her in the middle of the lake. They could join forces. They could be a team. They could save the world. But Mary might kill me when it's all over. Angela would not put it past her. She found the door to Mary's cabin lying wide open when she came to a halt at the end of the long gravel driveway. The cabin was nestled in the midst of a thick forest. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away. Flies buzzed around Angela's head as she got out of her car. "Hello?" she called. "Mary?" Oh, God. There was a foot inside a black shoe lying in the cabin doorway. It was a man's leg, and it was attached to a man's body. Angela took a step closer, then stopped and grimaced. Already, with only half of the body in view, she could see a dark puddle of blood had formed around the guy. Yeah, he was real dead, like the 2 at the party last week. Another step closer, and she could see that he had a hole in his chest that only a close-range shotgun blast could have caused. He lay on his back, with his mouth and eyes open and flies crawling all over him. Angela recognized the man, Officer Martin, one of the cops who had helped Nguyen capture Mary. Mary obviously had not appreciated his efforts. But the obvious was not always right. She had assumed Mary had done the guy, so she could escape and go after the monsters. But another step into the cabin showed Angela a sight that outdid all the horrors she had witnessed in the last few days. Mary, dressed in blue jeans and a blood-stained t-shirt, was hanging by the neck from a thin wire. She had on brown leather boots. The right one was beginning to slip off her foot. The blood was from the gaping wounds the wire had cut into her neck. Darn, tied that thing too tight while I was trying to commit suicide. That's what the evidence was supposed to tell everybody. Killed the cop, then felt guilty and decided to buy the big one by going for a swing after jumping off the nearby couch. Why, the shotgun was lying right there on the floor beneath Mary. Angela bet it even had Mary's fingerprints on the trigger. Angela moaned. "No, Mary." She closed her eyes and cried. "No." Angela didn't believe the evidence. In the last few days, she had learned a thing or two about those who had drunk too deeply from the lake. They had unique appetites. Angela reopened her eyes. The puddle around the cop was not big considering the extent of his wound. The stain on Mary's shirt was not that wide, given the incision in her neck. The Katu couldn't resist having a little snack, drinking a little blood, in the midst of business. Angela wished she hadn't thought about food right then. The next tragedy started with good intentions. She decided she couldn't just leave her friend hanging there. She fetched a chair from the kitchen and placed it below Mary's feet. She didn't believe she'd have the strength to lift enough of Mary's weight off the wire in order to pull the noose off of her friend's head. But either Mary had lost more weight in prison than either of them had realized, or else Angela Warner was now one strong babe. Angela had the wire off in seconds. She cradled Mary in her arms as they slumped to the carpeted floor. Beautiful Mary. Angela had always been so jealous of her shiny brown hair, her huge green eyes. At least Mary had had a chance to close them before the end had come. Angela buried her face in Mary's face and washed her friend's blood with her tears. "You were the brave one. You went after them alone. You didn't ask for help, and when you were stopped, you didn't complain. You were great. I will always remember you as great, even if the world will always despise you. I'm not you. I can't be you. But I swear I will not rest until what you began is finished, until every one of those blood-sucking bastards is lying in the dirt with a hole in his heart. Mary, Angela cried, uncontrollable sobs shaking her body. But these tremors had another cause besides grief. Angela couldn't stop shaking because she was hungry. She was holding her dead friend, her dead best friend, and she couldn't stop thinking about how good it would be to lean over and open her mouth and... I won't do it, she screamed. Still, she couldn't let go of Mary. She couldn't get up and run from the cabin and save what was left of her sanity. She closed her eyes and felt the edge of the incision in Mary's neck with her fingertips. Then she took the bloody fingers and pressed them to her own lips. And the thrill that went through her body was sexual in intensity, as incomparably ancient longing quenched for an instant in time. She sighed with pleasure and touched Mary's wound again, lightly and with respect, and lifted the fingers once more to her lips. The elixir Jim had let her taste. She sucked on her fingers hungrily, harder and harder, wanting to get the last drop. So hard, she began to eat her own hand. Angela, a voice said. She opened her eyes with a start. Lieutenant Nagoyan stepped into the room. Funny, she hadn't heard him drive up. Quickly, she wiped the blood off her mouth. Don't mind me. I was just drinking my friend's blood. Hello, she said. Nagoyan surveyed the scene and was forced to close his eyes. When he reopened them, he was the color of chalk. He stepped to her side and peered down at her. What happened here? He asked. Jim Klein was here, she said. You saw him? No? How do you know then? It's a long story. She eased Mary off her lap and onto the floor. She would have liked to kiss her friend goodbye, but not with company in the room. Nagoyan helped her to her feet. Have you been following me? Angela asked. Yes. Did you know? No? Tell me what happened, Nagoyan repeated. Angela stared him in the eye, and suddenly she felt a power go up her spine and into her head and out from her, as if she were a magnetic field with claws. The strange thing was that it didn't surprise her when it happened. It was as if it were a psychic muscle that had always been there, even before the madness had started, and she had simply never used it before. The power gave her a new sensitivity. She felt as if she held Nagoyan's mind in her hand. She couldn't read his thoughts, but she could touch them, as if they were made of matter. She suspected she could make him believe what she wanted him to believe, just by holding his eye and talking in a certain way. I can't, she said simply. Nagoyan blinked. What's happened to you, Angela? She swiped at her mouth again. She had missed a little bit of the blood. I've become a naughty little girl. I think I lost my virginity last night. I lost something, that's for sure. Her eyes bored into him. Inside his brain, she could actually feel his confusion, his horror of her, and he took an involuntary step back. Let me go, Nagoyan, she said softly. Quit following me. Let me do what I have to do. By the time you know enough to believe what is happening, you'll be dead. He was sweating heavily. He gasped. I don't know what you're talking about. Staring down at Mary one last time, she said, For your sake, I hope you never do. Angela left the cabin. Nagoyan didn't try to stop her. When she got home, Plastic was waiting for her at the front door. She ran inside without pausing, to shut the door behind her, and went into the bathroom, where she saw in the mirror someone she hardly recognized. Wild blue eyes, the color of Earth's sky. But what color would the sky be that she would look out from tomorrow? She still had Mary's blood all over her, on her nose, in her hair. Christ, she swore. She turned on the water, scalding hot, and splashed it on her face again and again, all the while crying pitifully. Her fingers were bleeding from where she had bitten them. Nevertheless, she pounded the countertop with her fists and heard it crack. She didn't want to be like them. She would kill them. She would kill herself first. Oh, go away, Angela moaned. Plastic had come into the bathroom and was trying to lick her hand. She had never seen the dog so friendly. Plastic must have known she was upset. Angela knelt to pet the dog on the head and scratch the fur on her back. Plastic just loved to be scratched. But the heat of the dog's tongue, the faint scent wafting off of it. Why, it smelled of beef blood. Plastic must have been chewing on her bone just before Angela drove up. Oh, why, Angela asked herself as her brain once more began to do the unthinkable voodoo dance of death. Couldn't the dog have been eating dry dog food? Just the smell of the blood. Angela didn't want to. I'm sorry, Angela cried. She grabbed the dog hard. It began to fidget, then to whimper. Angela reached out and dug her nails into the dog's neck. Plastic started to cry. Heart-piercing wails that Angela tried to quiet by reaching deep inside the dog's mouth. She was going to snap Plastic's face into 2 pieces. "Angie," a voice said. Angela let go of the dog, and Plastic dashed away as if she had a devil on her tail. Angela was breathing heavily. She looked up, although it was not necessary. She had recognized the voice. "Hello, Jim," she said. He knelt in front of her, looking so good. A healthy young man with his whole life in front of him. Maybe he lived to be 100,000 years old. She didn't know. He'd probably have huge leathery wings by then, and purple talons. His fingernails were black as ink already. He was holding the note her grandfather had left her the previous morning. Now she wondered why it had been typed as Jim handed it to her. "I wrote this," he said. She glanced at her grandfather's closed door. He never shut it when he went out. He always laughed and said that at his age he had nothing to hide. Jim had probably eaten him immediately after their first date, sneaked back into the house, and didn't even bother to stop and give his sleeping beauty a kiss. But maybe he had done her that small favor before he had stolen away another huge chunk of her existence. Maybe it was a kiss that had bestowed upon her the vision of the alien world. No, it was his blood. His blood was a concentrated form of the contaminated water. "I understand," she whispered. Her lower lip trembled, and she bit it and sucked on the blood. Jim put a hand on her shoulder. There was no warmth. A huge crab claw would have been more comforting. "Mary's dead," he said. "Yes." "You're one of us now," he said. "I understand." "There are lots of us." She looked up. "I'd like to meet them." "Whenever you want." "Tonight would be good." She forced a smile. "I'd like to have a party here for all of us."